All right, so welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Axel Santana. I'm an associate at PolicyLink. I go by he, him, his pronouns. I'm calling in from Tongva and Agja lands here in Southern California. I am also the co-chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus, along with my colleague, Derek Baldwin, for the Center for Disability Rights. For those of you who are not familiar, the Transportation Equity Caucus is a national network of organizations working together at the intersections of climate, transportation, racial justice, and a variety of other equity issues. We do most of our work together through our working groups, which include jobs and workforce, climate and transportation, federal policy implementation, and removing enforcement from transportation strategies. This webinar is being hosted by the Removing Enforcement Work Group and as a part of our 2023 TEC Learning Series. We'll be having future webinars on different topics, including on the topics of transportation workforce challenges, Justice 40, and disability justice. So be on the lookout for announcements and invitations for those in the coming months and weeks. For today, we'll be discussing how automated enforcement has the potential to perpetuate inequities in transportation. And before we jump in, just a quick reminder to keep yourself on mute while our presenters are speaking. We'll have some time at the end of the discussion to address any questions. So please feel free to throw those questions in the chat and the Q&A functions. We'll do our best to get to all of them, but if not, we'll follow up with answers to them and also be following up with recording the slides and a list of relevant resources from the discussion. And so we have a great panel of speakers for you today. I'm really excited to share this platform with my colleagues. We have Carlton Mayers II, who is the founder, owner, and CEO of Mayers Strategic Solutions, which is a firm that helps communities break down the silos that prevent the open and honest exchange of information so that community members and law enforcement can effectively collaborate with each other to support public safety and ensure police accountability. Ethan Campbell is a safe streets and bicycle advocate with Whose Streets Are Streets, which is a project of Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, a grassroots people-powered movement working to make the city safer, healthier, and equitable for all. Garo Jauregui is a program specialist at California Walks, a statewide advocacy organization that advances pedestrian safety and healthy, walkable communities for people of all ages and abilities. And Priya Sarati Jones is a deputy executive director at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, whose goal it is to create a justice system that treats individuals fairly, ensures public safety and the community prosperity, and is funded equitably. And before I jump too much further in, just also want to flag for folks that we have ASL interpreters joining us today. So if you would like to use them, please feel free to spotlight them on your screen, and we'll also do the same as well. So sharing some background information on today's discussion, as cities and jurisdictions have started to consider other approaches to safety outside of direct police enforcement, automated enforcement is increasingly being proposed as a solution. And so this conversation has started to proliferate as a result of all the violence and harassment we've witnessed over the years, which culminated with the murder of George Floyd and the 2020 racial justice uprisings. Some traditional transportation safety advocates have been pushing for automated enforcement as an alternative safety solution. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, automated enforcement includes the use of speed cameras, red light cameras, drones, and other automated mechanisms to enforce traffic safety. And while yes, it may increase the residents' direct interactions with police officers, it is also clear that there are a variety of challenges that arise from this approach. And as equity advocates, we're always asking who benefits and who pays. And in this case, automated enforcement can be problematic because it violates Fourth Amendment rights to privacy by putting cameras and other tracking mechanisms in our communities, and we're increasing the surveillance of Black, Indigenous people of color. And not only does it increase surveillance and data collection of residents, but it can also lead to over-policing and incarceration of communities of colors. And with the cameras being placed disproportionately in disinvested communities with inadequate infrastructure, and by perpetuating the fines and fees disparities that we see with regular law enforcement. And so given the debate around this topic, the Transportation Equity Caucus has developed a brief fact sheet that outlines some of these concerns, and we have posted it to our website, and I'll share it in a minute when I'm done speaking. And so that's what we'll be discussing today. Today's conversation is meant to be a discussion about the challenges and lifting up different perspectives. And the views expressed in this webinar or in any of the materials we share are not necessarily reflective of all the panelists and orgs represented on today's call. And so with that, I'll turn it to our panelists to take us through this discussion. Carlton, have you been able to join us by now?
Yep, I'm here.
Great.
I'm gonna leave my camera off for this section so people can focus on the slides.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll turn it over to Carlton, who will be sharing a bit about his work and the various automated enforcement technologies he's seeing being used and the challenges they pose. Carlton?
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today about unmanned drone use in traffic enforcement. Through my consulting company, I work with key public safety stakeholders on solving public safety challenges by focusing on especially empowering community members who live in neighborhoods with high levels of crime and high levels of negative police interactions, like racial profiling, excessive use of force, etc. So for today's presentation, surveillance technology and services are becoming the favorite solution to prevent negative police interactions. Given the public's attention on and criticism of law enforcement misconduct, including biased and race-based policing, the shortage in law enforcement staffing nationwide, the public's perception of increased crime across the country, the windfall of money and resources from local, state, and federal governments and private sources like police foundations to state and local law enforcement, and calls to prohibit or restrict law enforcement traffic stops and to replace armed law enforcement with unarmed civilians for traffic stops. As a result of this current climate, law enforcement is turning to technology as a colorblind alternative to help solve crime. A lot of law enforcement believe that technology could identify and enforce laws without any association to race, gender, or ethnicity. The collateral benefits that are being advertised are improved officer safety and reduced incidents of use of force. However, due to the ample information collected by surveillance technology, this raises red flags and is dangerous since it opens the door to the government violating people's search and seizure rights under the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution, which provides for an expectation of privacy and to be free from unreasonable intrusions by the government. This is especially the case since law enforcement is collecting information from a combination of various surveillance technologies, like unmanned drones, body-worn cameras, license plate readers, red light cameras, speed light cameras, etc. This is also dangerous because even if the technology is quote unquote race neutral, the people operating the technology have biases. The people coding the algorithms for the artificial intelligence have biases. And these biases will be incorporated into the operation of technology. Thus, discriminatory policing practices will not discontinue with usage of or reliance upon technology. So speaking of unmanned drones, an unmanned drone is also called an unmanned aerial system and is an aerial device with an onboard computer that is operated remotely, generally by a pilot on the ground using a handheld controller. Unmanned drones can be battery operated, weigh less than 2 pounds or more than 20 pounds, have several rotors like a helicopter, and are equipped with 1 to 6 video cameras. Since COVID, law enforcement has become more receptive to using unmanned drones as a critical element in almost every aspect of emergency operations. Currently, more than 5,000 first responder agencies have implemented unmanned drone programs, and an estimated 2/3 of them are law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement tends to use unmanned drones for traffic crash reconstruction, reconnaissance before tactical deployments, SWAT operations, hostage situations, traffic pattern evaluations, etc. However, there's a concern for unmanned drones being used for regular patrols and surveillance of protests. There's also concern that unmanned drones could be weaponized with rubber bullets, tear gas, or tasers. So for today's presentation, I'm only going to focus on 2 operations where unmanned drones are currently being used in regards to traffic enforcement. One of them, as you can see on the slide, is drone as first responder. So the drone as first responder operation utilizes an unmanned drone to fly to any reported incident via 911 call and arrive prior to the first responders on the ground. More specifically, the unmanned drones are launched from the roof of the police department and fly toward the scene of the incident, such as a crime in progress, serious accident, officer in need of assistance, etc. The video feed from the unmanned drone is viewed at the police department by a trained first responder called a teleoperator. The teleoperator is able to operate the unmanned drone remotely and communicate with field personnel via radio and mobile phones immediately. So I want to highlight something here. So when we're talking about a traffic stop and you have an officer speaking to a dispatcher, a lot of times they use terms like crime in progress, serious accident, officer in need of assistance. The teleoperator is listening to this conversation, and without any request, if they hear any of these terms, the teleoperator will automatically activate and send an unmanned drone to the site. So now you have a human being officer and you have a drone at the site of a traffic stop. Now understand, from the time that that unmanned drone is launched to the time that it gets to where it's supposed to get to the time it comes back from where it's been, those cameras and other sensors are fully operational. And so they are constantly collecting data, all right? And we have no idea what that data is going to be used for, who has access to it, who are they sharing it with, who are they selling it with, for what purpose, etc. All right, now the other thing that's dangerous here is that a lot of times these unmanned drones are using facial recognition technology. And facial recognition technology is notorious, according to studies, for misidentifying especially Black people. So you could have a Black driver and or a Black passenger in during this traffic stop. The unmanned drone is going to send some information based on the facial recognition technology to that officer saying this person has an outstanding warrant for their arrest. And that's actually not them, it's another Black person, right? And so now that officer will wrongfully arrest this person. Now, this could lead to a potential escalation of an incident that could result in an unnecessary person being severely injured or dead. So this is dangerous. So the police department that is known as the model for using drone as first responder is the Chula Vista, California Police Department. As you can see in this picture on this slide, that's a picture of them using the unmanned drone. They tend to use what they call the DJI drones, which cost around $35,000 each. At this time, there are about 16 police departments actively deploying drone as first responder programs. Next slide, please. There's also the artificial intelligence operated drone first responder. It's called the ED system. And the ED system's AI, artificial intelligence, is powered by the Scarlett software and incorporates facial recognition, gait recognition, clothes recognition, and behavioral algorithms to provide real-time 3D imaging and topography data. You can already see it doesn't have the rotors on it, so it's a lot more stealth and therefore more dangerous. Now, just to let you know, the Grand Rapids, Michigan police chief for the police department last week during a public hearing before the city council announced to the city council that he will be providing a proposal very soon to purchase 3 unmanned drones, similar to what Chula Vista uses on the previous slide. And he even laid out how he's going to use them for traffic stops. One of them has to do with the drone as first responder program that I just detailed. The other one is what I'm going to talk about right now. He said that let's say you have somebody who's not pulling over when police say to pull over. Instead of doing a high-speed pursuit that can be dangerous, we can just send a drone up. The drone can follow the vehicle. Once the vehicle stops and the driver departs the car, officers can then converge on them and then safely arrest them. Now, we already know that's not what's going to happen. There's going to be an escalation. Somebody's going to end up unnecessarily severely injured or dead. So this is very dangerous, in addition to the facial recognition technology and all the information being collected without any guardrails in place. Next slide, please. So the next model is the patrol-led drone deployment model, which places unmanned drones in the trunks of patrol vehicles, where they can be quickly deployed at incident scenes by secondary officers to provide situational awareness as to the locations of subjects, presence of weapons, and other related hazards. This deployment model is exemplified by the Oklahoma City Police Department, which implemented its programs with Skydio drones, which use a series of cameras to detect objects and avoid collisions. Skydio drones are AI-powered quadcopters that cost as little as $1,000, which can latch onto targets such as pedestrians and cars and follow them while dodging obstacles. This model can also provide complementary support and safety during canine operations. Okay, we're talking about traffic stops, right? So besides this model of drone following bicyclists and cars, it could also be used for canine, meaning that you have one officer with a canine, another one in the car can pop open the trunk, use one of these handheld drones that has night vision, thermal vision. Now you have more eyes on what's going on in the vehicle. In my opinion, this is infringing upon people's Fourth Amendment rights, like we talked about earlier. So that's one use of it. Now, the other use is, let's say you have a civilian who's unarmed and is engaging in traffic stops. They work for law enforcement, right? So they feel kind of wary about approaching a car because there might be guns or weapons, whatever. They can pop open the trunk use this Skydio drone to be the eyes for them while they sit in their own vehicle, looking via their mobile phone at what's in that vehicle. And then they can determine, should they engage, should they call for assistance, or should they call for an unarmed mental health professional? Either way, those red flags will still exist. Facial recognition technology, all these cameras without knowing what this information is being used for, and the biases of the people operating the cameras. Next slide. Let's talk about solutions. So, federal governance. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, regulates drone safety and manages all of the airspace in the US. However, US Congress and the FAA have not set guidelines on concerns around speech, privacy, and discrimination. They tend to leave that up to state and local governance. So for state governance, there are 29 states currently with laws on drone use and privacy. In 18 of them, police officials must secure warrants for drone video surveillance and searches. The state that is considered the model state law for the country is Illinois. Under the 2014 Illinois Freedom from Drone Surveillance Act, public agencies are barred from collecting any evidence, images, sounds, data, or other information using a drone. And Illinois' law requires a warrant by a judge for other uses. Next slide. And then as it relates to local governance, there's a growing number of municipalities around the country that are adopting ordinances that govern the purchase, acquisition, use, and deployment of all surveillance technologies, including of the police department and also, even more broadly, of city government agencies. They're basing this language off of ACLU's Community Control Over Police Surveillance, also known as CCOPS template legislation. And for time's sake, I'm just going to talk about Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we can talk about, the other stuff during the Q&A. So the work I've done in Grand Rapids, Michigan with NAACP, Greater Grand Rapids Branch, and also with ACLU, Michigan, has had to do with making changes to Grand Rapids, Michigan's existing local law that governs the purchase, acquisition, use, and deployment of all surveillance technologies, including the police department's body-worn cameras. So one thing we did was we created a civilian surveillance oversight committee that will now be working with the local government officials on making decisions on the purchase, acquisition, use, and deployment of all surveillance technologies. They also require that an early impact statement is provided by applicants. This impact statement will include what the potential disparate impacts are, a mitigation plan on how they're going to mitigate those impacts, who has access to the data, who they're going to share it with, how they're going to share it, et cetera. This information must be made public before any decisions are made. And then another civilian oversight authority called the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability is now tasked with receiving complaints about the use of technologies and doing an audit on those complaints, in addition to doing quarterly audits every year of all surveillance technologies and annual audits of all surveillance technologies. As a result of the annual audit, there will be an annual surveillance report published on the city's website for everybody to see, laying out, for instance, were there any violations of civil rights or civil liberties that year by the technology? Were there any complaints filed against the use of technology that year? Broken down by race, gender, age, and location. And then subsequent to that, there'll be a public hearing where this information will be provided to the public and allow for a public comment on this information. So to wrap it up, next slide. Thank you so much. Please do keep in touch. You can reach out and get more information from me at empower@mayorsolutions.com or my website, www.mayorsolutions.com, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Thank you, and please do keep in touch.
Thank you, Carlton, for all the information. Really helpful. Look forward to diving into some of that. So next up, we'll turn it over to Ethan Campbell with Whose Streets Are Streets to talk us through some of the challenges they're dealing with in Seattle.
Great. Thank you, Axel. And a huge thanks to everyone with Transportation Equity Caucus for organizing this webinar and to you all for being here. I'm Ethan Campbell. I'm a safe streets advocate and a mobility justice advocate here on Duwamish lands in the great city of Seattle. I'm representing Whose Streets Are Streets, but I'm also involved with other groups that do bike walk advocacy. And separately, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington. We're speaking about automated traffic camera enforcement, specifically both the pitfalls and some solutions. And before I start, I want to be very clear that I'm not here to tell you that automated enforcement is bad, that you should just say no to it. I'm also not here to tell you that it's good. I think we should view automated enforcement as a tool that has both safety benefits and the potential to cause harm. So my hope today is that I can present a nuanced and balanced perspective on automated enforcement that gets at the question, on balance, is it worth it? And that's a question that I won't answer because my group hasn't answered that yet. We don't have a simple yes or no stance on automated enforcement. But what I can do today is try to poke at a few of the challenging questions that it raises. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our group, Whose Streets, Our Streets. We are a BIPOC focused work group convened in 2020 by Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, which is Seattle's Safe Streets advocacy nonprofit. We use a pro-equity, anti-racist framework to review laws and policies governing the use of streets in Seattle and develop a vision of how our city can be a safe, thriving place without the use of armed police. We're dedicated to reviewing and revising laws and policies to better meet the needs of all street users, in particular the BIPOC communities that have historically been excluded from the free and full use and governance of this shared public space. You can learn more at our website here. And yeah, next slide. So we've been working on this topic for about the past year, and a little bit of context first. So last year, Seattle announced plans to double its number of school zone speed cameras. In 2023, that would be about 35 additional locations. And I'll talk more about what those cameras are. A preliminary analysis by Seattle's Department of Transportation found that these cameras have been disproportionately placed in communities of color for reasons that, as I'll share, are not surprising. And since then, we've been pushing the city to make its automated enforcement program more equitable before it places these additional cameras. We've been doing that in a number of ways. We've been reaching out to community through surveys, through a town hall that we held in March, and this blog post and an op-ed. And I think I'll put a link to the op-ed in the chat here for you all. And it's not just us in Seattle, of course, it's across the country. Communities are having these conversations, and I'll highlight some general aspects about automated enforcement and try to use Seattle as a case study for specific issues that have cropped up. For full disclosure, we at Whose Streets, Our Streets have been under contract with SDOT to do community outreach and engagement really broadly around the topic of BIPOC community safety in Seattle's transportation system. So that does put us in the slightly strange position of both being partly funded by SDOT while also advocating for them as an agency to be changing their policies. But the type of engagement that we've been doing and the topics that we've been focusing on have been left up to us. Next slide, please. I want to start here by grounding us in the fact that, like gun violence, traffic violence is a uniquely American epidemic that I would say too many of us have normalized and accepted. This chart is from the New York Times, and it shows that while other countries have been making progress on road safety, the US hasn't. And those who are most vulnerable are those who are outside of cars, people walking and biking. We all know this. Why this has been so bad in the US has to do with a number of factors. Chief among them, the design of our roadways, which tend to prioritize speed over safety, as well as the design of our communities, which has led to our dependence on cars, and the size and weight of our vehicles in the US. There are other factors that I don't have time to get into today, but I wanted to start by really hammering this home because it's an issue and we need to address it. Next slide. And that has led to the fact that over 40,000 people died in traffic crashes in the US last year. Each year in Seattle, an average of 28 people are killed and 180 people are seriously injured on our streets. And that takes place predominantly in communities of color. The image in the background here is from the group that launched WSOS, Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, and we memorialized those deaths with these photos for each life lost. I'm sure we can all name someone we know who's been injured or killed on our roadways. So I want to make clear here that traffic violence touches all of us, and it's not something that we should be normalizing or accepting. Next slide. We know that speed kills. Numerous studies show that vehicle speed at the time of impact is directly correlated to whether someone walking will live or die. So what this chart shows, for someone walking, being hit by a car moving at 20 miles an hour, you have a 90% chance of surviving, compared to a 20% chance if that car is moving at 40 miles an hour. We also know that high-speed crashes are more likely to occur in the first place than crashes at lower speeds. And when they do occur, they're more likely to be deadly. And what this means is that small reductions in speed result in really large safety gains. There's a frequently cited study that found that for every mile-an-hour reduction in average speed, there's an 8% reduction in fatal injuries. So I want to emphasize speed kills. Next slide, please. Traffic camera enforcement has been proven to reduce speeding and crashes. We should be very clear about that. The degree to which that is the case, it's very context dependent, but these numbers are backed by solid research. And there's this guide that just came out from the Federal Highway Administration and NHTSA that cites this figure 20 to 30% reduction in roadway fatalities and injuries from speed cameras. And this is solid research. There's, I think I would say the evidence base on the efficacy of red light cameras is shakier, but it's beyond debate at this point that speed cameras do improve safety and they do reduce the likelihood of someone dying in a crash. In Seattle, according to SDOT data, at locations where speed cameras were installed, there's been a 71% drop in collisions during school hours when they're turned on. And even when they're not turned on, there's been a 50% drop during the rest of the day or during the entire day. For red light cameras, we've seen a 5 to 25% drop in collisions, depending on the context and type of collision, and a 40% drop in fatal collisions. So this technology does work, but it's not without its pitfalls, as we'll get to. Next slide. So what am I talking about when I say automated enforcement? The diagram on the left is of a speed camera, and in Seattle, we have school zone speed cameras, school speed zone cameras. They've been in place since 2012. Currently, there are 35 cameras at 19 schools. And I'm not going to dwell too much on the technology, but the basics here are that these systems estimate speed and include cameras that capture images of a car if that vehicle is traveling some threshold over the speed limit. And in Seattle, as well as Chicago and other cities, that threshold is 6 miles an hour. In other locations, that threshold is 10 or 11 miles an hour. And in Washington, only the images of the license plate are used to ID the vehicle. In some other locations, they may be using front-facing vehicles or photos of the driver. Those get matched with a driver's license photo to ID a specific driver. So there are different circumstances, different ways that this is implemented, and citations are generally reviewed by a human. And in Washington, by state law, that has to be a law enforcement officer, and these violations end up getting mailed. The violations that get accepted, I should say, that some can be rejected. They get mailed within a few weeks to your home address or to the registered address of the vehicle. There's a number of different types of automated enforcement cameras that have been authorized by the legislature in Washington. We have red light cameras in Seattle, a number of them. Transit-only lane cameras and blocked intersection cameras recently were added in 2022, mostly downtown. For a short time, there were cameras on a bridge that was closed in Seattle, enforcing that restriction. And last year, the legislature radically expanded the authorization for speed camera use to areas near parks, hospitals, walk-to-school routes, and priority locations for road safety that have a high number of collisions. And this year, they expanded that to include construction work zones on state roads. So I would say Washington State has been a bit of a laboratory for testing these technologies out, and also I would say testing the public response to them, which is why I think it's so interesting to look at the situation in Seattle. Next slide, please. So the remaining part of this presentation, I want to highlight a few what I'm going to call conundrums and try to present in a balanced way some common refrains that I hear when it comes to automated enforcement, and also present the reality as I see it, as our group sees it, as we've seen it in Seattle. And for each of these, I'll try to share some data from Seattle as a bit of a case study, and using this Axios format of yes, but. So to start here, the traffic safety conundrum, right? We know automated enforcement isn't the only or the most effective way to create safety. That is beyond debate. In an ideal world, cities would be prioritizing smarter, safer street design that's self-enforcing, creating slower speeds through physical infrastructure changes. Right? We can narrow the street, we can put in curb bulbs, speed cushions, raise crosswalks with flashing beacons, we can put in bike lanes. can daylight intersections, we can add hardened center lines at intersections, all of these tools and tricks that recognize that we can use design to create the behavior we want to see. Right? And issuing tickets to those who drive at the fast speeds encouraged by roads that are poorly designed, roads that look like highways, can be seen as punishing people for behaving in a way that is really entirely predictable given that street design. I would say that cities across the country are starting to realize this, but it's going to require a culture shift in planning agencies and among all of us to accept that we need changes in road design, and that will entail trade-offs of more inconvenience while driving in exchange for more safety. With 4 lanes in the top right. And they took out a lane in each direction, added a center turning lane with a center median here. And the results from this, you could call it a road diet, have been pretty remarkable that where this has taken place, injury collisions are down, collisions with people walking and biking are down, and top end speeding is also decreased. So we know that these changes work. We know that automated enforcement is not the only tool in our toolbox. And I think that my perspective here is that, operating a 2-ton motor vehicle is an incredibly and inherently dangerous activity. It's a dangerous activity for both those inside and outside the car. And therefore, perhaps we should expect it to be something that is strictly regulated in the US, including through enforcement mechanisms, just like other dangerous activities. I think that's maybe one view, and automated enforcement could be one way to do that. Yeah, next slide. But that brings me to what I would call the disproportionate impact conundrum. So in Seattle, our automated enforcement cameras, according to an SDOT analysis, have been disproportionately placed in lower income communities with more people of color compared to wealthier, whiter communities. You can see that in this map here, which is showing the locations of the cameras. The red area in Seattle's south end is an area of higher disadvantage by one metric. And the way that a lot of these programs are implemented to have the greatest safety benefit, these cameras are placed on roadways that have the most speeding, collisions, and injuries. And that makes sense because not doing so would undermine the program's credibility. It can give people the impression that cameras are for revenue generation rather than road safety. But I would say the really inevitable outcome here is that in practice, this leads to automated enforcement disproportionately impacting BIPOC drivers. And that's because of our history of racialized disinvestment in safe streets, which has led to the roadways with the most speeding, collisions, and injuries running through communities of color. And you can try to, say, balance the distribution of cameras by setting, say, a quota for each council district in a city for a number of cameras, make sure it's geographically balanced, but that's inevitably going to dilute their safety impact because that won't be prioritizing safety at the top of the list there. So this is a trade-off, and it really raises some tough questions that I don't think I have answers to. Next slide, please. This next one is I call the policing replacement conundrum, and I hear a lot of times that automated enforcement is a great thing because it's an improvement from police traffic stops. If we're replacing them on a one-to-one basis, that's a great thing, especially for BIPOC communities. Unlike police officers, cameras issue tickets at least on the surface, an unbiased way. They can't shoot you, and they can't enable pretextual investigative stops. Right? So it gets rid of a lot of those harms. But the reality is that automated enforcement has not actually replaced police traffic stops in cities where it's been implemented. Instead, it's often led to a massive increase in the number of tickets issued. And we've seen that here in Seattle, where, as this chart shows from the courts, tickets issued by police have been declining, not because of automated enforcement. And tickets issued by automated enforcement cameras have been going up. And as of last year, they issue 200,000 tickets every year. That's a ton of tickets. And that's about 50 times more than officers give out in in-person traffic stops. So I think we should not pretend that automated enforcement is replacing policing in some intentional or structured way. Next slide. This one is the fines and fees conundrum. And in Seattle, we know that these tickets are really expensive. They're $237 for a speeding ticket, $139 for a red light ticket, and about a third of all tickets go unpaid and get sent in collections. We know that fines and fees have the potential to contribute to spiraling debt for low-income drivers, and that flat rate fines are inherently regressive. We should be divesting from these approaches. And at the same time, it is really possible to reduce the harm significantly caused by these fines and fees. Cities can reduce fines across the board to low levels. They can make first-time violations a warning, because in Seattle, we know that 95% of drivers never receive a second ticket from the same location. And yet we still give out tickets instead of warnings for first-time violations. One can offer automatic waivers or reductions for low-income drivers, perhaps predicated on federal or state assistance programs to avoid that income verification problem. And cities can treat automated enforcement tickets like parking tickets, and I would say they should do so it doesn't go on your record. In practice, many jurisdictions don't implement a lot of these practices. Criteria for waiver or reduction programs are often really challenging to implement or too restrictive. And unlike in other countries that have implemented income-based tiered ticketing, we really haven't done that in a big way in the US. And that limits the potential to have automated enforcement be equitable. Next slide. The revenue conundrum. So I think we all know automated enforcement can be easily misused as a predatory revenue source. When camera revenue goes to a city's general fund, it makes the city dependent on punitive ticketing to balance its budget, and it creates a perverse incentive to expand enforcement and avoid fixing streets. That said, this is, I think, pretty easily fixed in that you can mandate that all camera revenue goes towards local street safety improvements, which is the case in Seattle for its speed school zone speed cameras. And I should say that in practice, cameras are rarely removed, even when streets improve. And this does leave some dependency in terms of the budget on camera revenue. But the benefit of this is that directing funds to these projects can reduce the need for enforcement. This case study for Seattle, we see about $20 million in annual total revenue from automated enforcement cameras. Most of those are from speeding tickets. And as I mentioned, 90% of that goes back into community through school street safety projects and safety education in schools. A minimal flat rate goes to operations and maintenance of the cameras. And for red light tickets, the situation is different. It's not a lot of revenue, but 80% of that does go into the city's general fund, and our group is pushing for that to be changed, for that to be directed into safe streets projects as well. Then there's the surveillance conundrum. Next slide, please. And in Seattle, Washington state law limits the use of automated enforcement cameras to just traffic enforcement. We saw the efficacy of this prohibition last year when a bicyclist, Rob Mason, was killed in a hit-and-run collision. And Seattle police were not able to use images from a nearby automated enforcement camera to identify the driver, even in this really shocking, sad incident where that camera likely captured a photo of the perpetrator. And that said, there was state legislation that was proposed to change that situation. That bill didn't pass. Would have opened up these cameras for any law enforcement purpose with a court warrant. So I would say this, it's a strong foundation, but it is also shaky. It's something that could change any year if public opinion changes about the use of these cameras. And there's essentially a network of surveillance cameras that have been put out around the city, and their use could change radically if a bill were passed like that. So that this is the common criticism that automated enforcement is a surveillance technology. It can undermine public's trust in government, particularly within communities of color that have been victimized by mass state surveillance. And it's really just the perception of surveillance alone. I think that's for most people that we're hearing from in Seattle, our group at least, it's the perception of surveillance that feels uncomfortable. As I mentioned, you can have robust state legislation that prevents cameras from being used for other purposes. And in practice, I think to be very honest, automated enforcement that uses just a license plate image is no more intrusive from a privacy perspective than automated tolling on highways. And that's something that we've accepted as a society as a necessary part of our transportation system. So I want to avoid sort of hyperbolizing about the surveillance aspects here. It's a concern, it's a legitimate and understandable concern, but it's also the reality is that the harm that it's causing right now is fairly limited, I would say. The last slide here, I want to talk about accountability. And, obviously government should be accountable to communities. Many would say they ought to obtain consent before placing a surveillance technology into a community. And local communities should be able to reject unwanted surveillance technologies. That said, with automated enforcement, the question of what accountability looks like, what consent looks like, is really pretty tricky because public opinion is strongly divided on the use of these cameras, with many, especially those who walk, bike, and use transit rather than drive. Those so-called vulnerable road users, many support their use, the use of automated enforcement, and it's challenging to implement equitable public input processes, and these are frequently weaponized historically to block and delay changes that improve roadway safety. That's something that we should be cognizant about, and we see in Seattle here. This is a survey on the right side here, preliminary results from a survey that our group has run online, and we've seen that largely, broadly speaking, respondents have been seeing automated enforcement favorably, thinking that reporting that the benefits of ticketing outweigh the harms, and these are people who have gotten to the survey actually from that op-ed that we wrote about the disproportionate impact of ticketing on communities of color. And 71 or 73% of all respondents think the benefits outweigh the harms. But when you break that down by those who could afford a ticket versus those who reported they could not afford a ticket, you see really starkly different views on automated enforcement. And that shouldn't be a surprise, but it should remind us that the impact of enforcement is unequal. And the same goes for the sort of push-pull question of should Seattle continue to invest in these cameras? If you look at the full set of respondents, most think we should. But if you look at just those who could not afford a ticket, opinion gets a lot more negative. And this poll I think that the demographics of those we reached were on average whiter than Seattle's population, on average wealthier. And it included a lot of people in the Safe Streets advocacy community. So that's a caveat that I would share with us, but we are seeing in our community engagement and outreach that public opinion is divided. So my last slide, just want to remind, or just wanted to bring up this question again. On balance, do we think automated traffic camera enforcement is worth it? I can't answer this, but I hope that what I've shared today will help you answer that for yourself. And thank you for listening, and pass it on to, I think, Carl.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. And thanks everybody for rejoining us. Appreciate you hanging on with us as we deal with these tech challenges. So now we're going to move to Gato with California Walks, who will touch on how this discussion is playing out in California. Gato?
Yes, hi, thank you. So my name is Gato Jauregui, and I'm with California Walks. I know Axel read this in the beginning, but I'll go ahead and say it again. California Walks is the California statewide voice for pedestrian safety and healthy walkable communities for people of all ages and abilities. One of the things that I really want to share out with you is one of our values. We believe that those who have been harmed by oppressive systems and those most impacted by planning and political decisions should direct the development and implementation of solutions. So for about 2.5 years, I was the co-executive director of California Walks, and that meant that I was the policy lead for the organization. I am now on my way out of the organization, and I'm no longer the policy lead, so I just want to make sure you all know that. My last day at California Walks is actually May 15th. And today I will be sharing with you some history on California's automated speed enforcement bills and just kind of some takeaways that I'd like to share regarding the importance of discussing these concerns collectively and in community, just as we are today, Zoom bombs and all. So here's a little bit of history about the California automated speed enforcement bills in California. So the first thing is currently automated speed enforcement is not legal in California. From my knowledge, since at least 2017, there have been several iterations of an automated speed enforcement bill in the California state legislature. In 2017, the bill that was presented to the state legislature was a pilot to do automated speed enforcement in only 2 cities, the cities of San Jose and San Francisco. And I believe it was like it had a sunset. So I believe it was just for 5 years. Ultimately, this bill was not approved and did not become law. One thing that's important for me to share too is that in 2017, California Walk's leadership, which I was not, did support this bill. Then in 2020, the world changed. And in response to the racial uprisings, California Walk's staff, we entered into what we call an internal reflection process, which we call the anti-racist framework. We wanted to check in with ourselves and see what harm we might have caused and how through our work we might have perpetuated racism and in particular anti-Blackness. This entire process took a series of several months. I think it was like the whole summer, June, July, August. And really the biggest takeaway and the immediate takeaway was that together as a team, we decided that we were going to drop enforcement as one of our 6 E's. So for those of you who are involved already in active transportation, everyone talks about the E's: encouragement, engagement, equity. I'm going to forget them. And one of them is usually always, engineering. And one of them is usually always enforcement. Well, we decided we were going to drop enforcement because we no longer wanted to share enforcement that we felt was causing harm, in particular to Black people and brown people in our state. So we just took that kind of out of our toolkit. I use the word toolkit because I hear a lot of people in our space use that word too. So then in 2021, there was another iteration of the automated speed enforcement bill that was introduced in the state legislature. I believe this one was also a pilot for 5 years in 5 cities, including San Jose and San Francisco, and it had other cities that I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember. I think one of them was LA. Given our commitment to causing no harm, or as much as possible, California Walks opposed this bill in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. We submitted a letter of opposition stating concerns around enforcement and in particular concerns around policing in communities of color, and again, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods. This has been stated before, but one of the main things that we see across California is really that due to the disinvestment in low-income communities and communities of color, that is often the reason why people speed, because of the way the road is literally built. And so we believe that the way to move forward is to focus on changing the road rather than placing cameras in these communities that have already been targeted. So ultimately, the proposed bill in 2021 was not approved and did not become law. In 2022, there was another iteration of the bill that was introduced. At that time, California Walks did not take a stance, full transparency, due to low capacity. But ultimately, that bill was not approved and did not become law. Again, this year in 2023, there's another effort another bill has been introduced to do automated speed enforcement in the state of California. As of right now, California Walks has not taken an official stance. What I can share is that over time, in general, from 2017 to 2023, there have been some changes where the authors and supporters of automated speed enforcement have tried to address the concerns. So some of the things, for example, let's see if I can remember them. Some of them include making sure that the fee is much smaller than, say, what it was in 2017. So over time, that's changed. Another thing that I can think of that has changed over time is how long a law enforcement agency can keep records of basically people's information due to the privacy concerns that a lot of us have raised, including the ACLU. And finally, I'm just going to end with just kind of sharing my experience about the importance of collaboration and respectful discussion. So as I prepare to leave California Walks after 8 years, and from my experience in this work, one of the biggest takeaways I have to share is around the importance of collaboration and respectful discussion. Unfortunately, in our space here in California, we've experienced a general disinterest from partners in the field of active transportation and mobility justice in hearing other people's point of view. Often, folks have been confrontational rather than inquisitive or seeking to understand. We have been accused of not supporting survivors of traffic violence because we don't support automated speed enforcement. Everyone's opinions in this space should be valued, including those of people who belong to the communities who are most targeted by enforcement. Our organization, California Walks, is primarily made up of Latina women. We represent the state, and we present probably the second group racially that is targeted by law enforcement and in the criminal justice system. I think a major takeaway too is that in the end of the day, and again, this has been shared by the previous speakers, but in the end of the day, automated speed enforcement is enforcement. Just to share with you all, some of the arguments that we've heard in favor of automated speed enforcement that we like to invite people to think through are that automated speed enforcement is, I've been told, the most inexpensive option and solution. And I really I think Ethan raised this too. Well, expensive, what do you mean? Are we just talking about monetary? At what cost? We have to take into account the full social costs, not just, the financial costs. And is it okay to continue to surveil communities of color? And if you think it's okay, you should really think about that. I've also heard a lot lately that automated speed enforcement is the only solution. I just have concerns about that because, automated speed enforcement still doesn't get to the root of the issue, which I believe I'm hoping I'm making, and I think some of our previous speakers have too, which is it's about the built environment. People, drivers, bicyclists, people walking, people who use the road respond to the road. And so once you change the road, it will literally change how people walk in it, drive in it. That's what we believe is the root. Finally, if I could just leave you with what I think equity means. equity to me means that I believe you, that I believe in your story, I believe in your experience, I believe in what you have to share, and I actually care about it. So in the context of automated speed enforcement, I think at the bare minimum, ensuring equity means that we remain open, listening to concerns, again, especially of those who live in the communities and represent the demographic of folks who would be most targeted and who are most targeted by law enforcement. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Caro. And yeah, great segue, thinking about the financial costs and for who will have to pay. I think turning to Bria to talk to us a little bit about the fines and fees aspect of automated enforcement. And I will pull up the slides again, Bria, while you get started.
Great, thanks. And good afternoon / morning, everyone. Thanks for having FFJC and me here to talk a bit about the enforcement side specifically of automated traffic enforcement technology. I am the executive director of the deputy executive director of the organization, and we have been dedicated to looking at how fines and fees show up in both the criminal legal system and traffic system, and oftentimes they overlap. Next slide. So I think the first thing to really talk about is, our issue really sits in the center of when we're talking about revenue generation ideas, we're talking about how this technology plays into these, how the revenue generation motivates one policy and sits with one policy, and where these kind of conflicts of thinking arise from. Also just pointing at that flat fines and hidden taxes, which is the way that fees that automated traffic enforcement technology is enforced, right? It is the financial mechanisms. Those are disproportionately harming vulnerable communities because anytime you use money as the accountability measure, then people who don't have money will always be more harmed than people who do have money. It's just inherent in using a financial system as a punishment system. And I think this has really been touched on by Ethan and Caro, is that when you lead with enforcement, when you're attempting to address street safety, then you're missing the root cause of what is leading to traffic violence, right? And when those solutions are predominantly in the enforcement side, then we're not focusing on how the incidents are occurring. And like other forms of violence, like many other issues in the criminal justice system, we have been punitive as a country. We have lent towards enforcement, which has led us to mass incarceration, which has led us to a lot of problems that many of us are of a certain age have inherited from decisions that have happened in the past. And this is one of these opportunities where we can actually think ahead and not put the next generation or 100 years from now, people trying to untangle some short-sighted decisions that we're making, that we could actually take a moment to step back from and think about the big picture and how we use these types of things and how they interact with each other. I think the other thing to just point out is all of the policy goals that are talked about here, that aren't even talked about here, they're all important. They are also very equally important because there is harm involved in all of them. And so I am not convinced that we cannot come up with a solution package that addresses all of our concerns, as long as we are prioritizing that we want the best outcomes, and that's what's going to focus on what solutions we come up with. Next slide, please. So lots of technology. We learned about surveillance drones earlier. I learned a ton from that. But when FFJC is talking about ATE, we are talking about the types of technology that elicit fines and fees, right? There's a citation, and the punishment is some type of financial sanction. And so here's like a broad list of things that we're seeing already, right, that are coming up. License plate readers is not on this list, but it's another form of technology that's used in the traffic world, all of which come with financial sanctions. Red light cameras and speed cameras are the most prevalent, the most common use of this technology. It is the starter into this world in a lot of places. But when we say ATE, we mean the whole umbrella of technology that leads to this. And I do know, like, the research and the conversation does have to be nuanced, and all of us need to work on our language of, if you are only talking about bringing a speed camera or speed technology to your jurisdiction, then you have to rebuke some of the other stuff that isn't proven in evidence, that isn't supported by anything, because if you open up the door, the technology will take a life of its own. So next slide, please. This is just a quick map that we put together just to give you all a sense of where some of the speed camera and lead cameras are used, authorized, prohibited. I think it gives you a sense of what the country right now looks like. And there are tons of bills being introduced right now in this legislative session to turn some of these states from states that either don't use them to allowing for jurisdictions in the state to use them. So that's a very active issue right now, where we're seeing it across the country for probably the reasons that have been outlined here, is that there is a real sense of what do we do about the traffic violence that's going on, and where does this tool come in as part of that? Next slide, please. And, I focus on the red light and speed cameras because I think that is the most prevalent form of technology. It is also oftentimes introduced in the school zone sort of realm or work zones, where the audience we're talking about protecting already has a great deal of support, right? And so it elicits a lot of feelings and emotions. And as a parent myself, I understand where that is coming from. But thinking about when and how we use this technology is really, really important, because we are trying to protect society overall, right? And that protection comes in a lot of ways. So some of the goals that have been stated and objectives of these systems are to deter drivers from the act itself, right? And lower the fatalities, injuries, slow people down if they get hit by the cars, lower speeds, even better for outcomes. Some of this is just punitive, right? It is we will punish you in order to get you to do the thing that we want. I think this is super important. I raise children. I have a great deal of power over my kids at this age. I can make them do almost anything with enough will and exertion of my power over them. But what is effective in the long run is not me using that power over them at every step that I can. It's actually a longer, slower, arduous process of developing things in them that allow for them to make the right decisions over time. And a lot of that is setting them up with the tools and infrastructure that they need in order to make the right decisions, in order to give them choices, but good ones to make, versus sort of setting them up and then punishing them when they do fail and inevitably fail. And the other real major reason for these is to limit law enforcement interaction with people. That's really important. There's a lot of reasons to look at this technology as a valuable tool in that limitation, but it's not the only thing to consider. And lastly, this is not a stated objective of this technology, but revenue. It is part of the process. It is inherent in the system. And once you start getting the revenue from this type of technology, the governments, especially when they're crunched, and we're seeing that in real time right now, will turn to it as a source of revenue for their general budgets and for all of their projects that they'd like to fund, and the things that they can't or won't use political will to come up with more equitable budget solutions around. Next slide, please. Here, I think just to focus also on the policing interaction and technology, it's really important to go through the exercise of both looking at the value and the hardships that will come from the technology. These are some of the common stated pros and cons that come up when we're working with jurisdictions, when we're thinking about if you're going to introduce this technology, if you're going to change how you're using it, what are you hoping happens, right? What are the pros from this? But also, what are the cons? What are the things? And ultimately, if you do make a decision to use this technology and implement it, you have to be forthcoming with, you have considered the negatives and you are weighing the pros against them, not pretending like those negatives don't exist, because they absolutely do exist. And to discredit them and to not address them is very different than saying you're making some type of conscious decision to put one decision over the other. Next slide, please. And it's super important to keep in mind that when we're talking about ATEs, we're talking about laying technology over an existing system. Enforcement of traffic exists. It exists in every single jurisdiction across the country, in every state. That is not new news. Fines and fees, not new news. Been doing that since the beginning founding of this country. We've had fines. But what it does do is you take technology and you lay it over a human practice, you exponentially increase the use of citations and fines and fees just by the technology alone. You take a city like DC that used to issue 50,000 traffic tickets a year at one point before introducing its technology, and now issues over 1.3 million citations a year in the same square mileage, right? That is exponentially greater than any human traffic stop could ever be, which means that all the fines and fees that come with that are now scattered across many communities and families in the area. And when you take DC for example, they have issued $1 billion. They generate hundreds of millions of dollars each year using camera technology in the district. It's not limited to speed camera technology, but it is one of the primary sources. 9 out of the 10 of these are speed cameras. We have never had more accidents and fatalities in this city than we have in the last 2 years, right? So with the increase of technology, we aren't actually seeing an overall decrease in what is happening on the street safety side. In fact, it's getting worse, right? Not necessarily where the cameras are, but really speaks to, unless you're going to enforce every single city block, what do we need to be doing as a community that actually will allow for us to have inherently safer systems in the city? And like I said, over 1 million tickets are issued annually in the city. Next slide, please. And the revenue that comes from ATE, we cannot ignore it. I know that there are a lot of answers out there putting it towards the systems themselves. I think there's some really good conversation around thinking about where the money goes if you have a system and how it's generated, so it doesn't become a dependent nature of the money. So the money doesn't matter, right? Regardless of what you generate, where it goes is inconsequential to the important programs and work that you do. It just sort of goes somewhere. But what you're seeing here, and this is, right out of the most recent report from the Federal Highway and Safety Administration, that this must be about road users. If you're going to use this technology, specifically and exclusively, they're talking about speed cameras and using data-driven approaches that are not based on revenue generation. And that's not just when you set up your program, that is every step of the way. That's 10 years from now if you have a program when you have a budget crunch and your mayor wants to change where the revenue is going, right? That is inherent to the system itself. And this is 2 great examples are Chicago and Washington, D.C., where progressive Democratic mayors in cities that have had a lot of policing issues and cities that have been at the center of a lot of the Black Lives Matters movements and police shootings, that they have used this technology to fund their general budgets. And when they had problems with their general budgets and found from, this is what they turned to. Both of these programs have been rolled out, and the expansion and changes in them, all under protecting citizens in the street safety realm, all of them have pivoted when we talk about rolling them back or we talk about making changes to them, to the money. They've all talked about what will happen to their budgets if we change our policies, even when those policies are driven by evidence and by safer streets initiatives. If they're going to chip away at the revenue, that is the conversation that mayors and cities are trying to have. And so this is where we are. This was just a couple of weeks ago where the mayor of DC said, we're going to use the revenue from this that had been allocated to street investment for our general budget. Next slide, please. I'm sorry that we got to work on a better version of this, but I did want to share it because it's an active thing we're doing. This is a really good illustration to me of what happens when you get an ATE ticket in DC, when you're just talking about the money. DC has rolled out a new technology, or is in the process, where they're going to use cameras in bus lanes. It's, I think, the first city that is going to use them on the buses themselves to enforce the bus lanes in DC. And those tickets will start at $200, which is pretty common in DC. $150 to $200 is the baseline fine. And you can see based on our wards, and like many cities, our wards are also based on race, right, where they overlap. Our lowest income wards that happen to also be our predominantly Black wards, like the way that the person living at the median income level in that ward experiences that $200 ticket is very different than someone living in Ward 3 with a much higher median income, right? And we looked at this in 2 ways. It's both as the $200 being the cap, right? That's the most expensive ticket. So what would the equivalent of that be for someone who's lower income? More like $50. And the reverse, if you keep $200 as the base, that's actually closer to $600-700 ticket, right? In another ward with someone living at a different income level. And is that the kind of ticket you'd like to get? Because I think people here would not be that big proponents for this type of technology, as every time they got a ticket, it would be closer to $700 for them, which is the exact same form of punishment that someone else is receiving, right? So it would actually be equitable if you did that. Next slide, please. And I think the other big misconception is that they're racially neutral, right? That the technology itself is racially neutral. You have to look a little bit deeper into this. You have to look at what the harms are, where those harms fall on economic and racial lines, what really happens, right? The technology people have already spoken to, it could be inherently flawed, but even the implementation of the technology in our neighborhoods that don't have better design, who's been the least invested in, who's then likely going to get the tickets, who has thoroughways running through their neighborhoods, right? Like these are all the questions where crashes happen and speeds are very high. There's a lot of historical reasons for that. And now we further exacerbate that those decisions by now punishing people who live in these neighborhoods for the decisions of generations before us. And that's something that really needs to be rolled in thoughtfully into this work. Next slide, please. In two cities, once again, Chicago and DC, that have been studied on the racial disparities of their programs, really looking at who is receiving these tickets and what that looks like on race lines. In DC, if you lived in a Black neighborhood, you were 17 times more likely to receive a violation, and it was going to cost you 16 times more per resident as a result of that, right? If you lived in a Black neighborhood. They also showed that 28% of the traffic and parking fines owed from tickets stem from late penalties, right? So not just the initial fine, but the doubling and tripling of these fines overall. And Chicago itself found that the highest share of camera tickets issued over a 4-year range, about almost 40% of them went to motorists in majority Black neighborhoods. So we can't ignore who's getting these tickets and where they're going. And there is racial disparity and obviously economic disparity in that as well. Next slide, please. Here are some really quick ways to start thinking about this. We also are not proponents for or against the technology itself. What we're here to highlight is that the technology is not just something you can accept on face value. You have to look at the harms. You have to look at then the fines, because the technology and the money can be separated. You can make an argument for the technology. What there's no evidence to show is that the level of the fine, the higher the fine, the more likely it is to deter, right? So when you start having $150 fines and $200 and $300 fines, there's absolutely no evidence that that is more impactful than a $5 fine. The only difference is how much revenue you generate, right? So if you really want to look at this, you need to have the right people at the table. You need to have options where you're not the first many tickets. Many people are only receiving one ticket. It doesn't have to be attached to a financial sanction. It can be attached to something else. You have to limit them to fines only. There should be no doubling penalties, all of this extra stuff. There cannot be a flat fine system. It is inherently inequitable to have a flat fine system. So if you're talking about equity, you're talking about racial equity, then that means you are not talking about flat fines, right? And so that is what you should be thinking about. And there's a series of other things, prioritizing the street placement, street designs, all these things that have been talked about as well. Next slide, please. I just want to end this by saying that, technology, it's not about technology. Technology isn't inherently good or bad. It is about what we do with it, right? It's about how we use it. It's about what protocols and things that we are putting in place to protect the community from the harms that we know can come from the technology. And we're actually all really experiencing this conversation, I think, more recently in very real time around all this AI technology, right? Like the conversation itself on technology is very, very expansive here. But I believe in our ability to solve problems without creating new problems or exacerbating existing problems. Like this generation of problem solvers, we can do better. We can be long-term thinkers. And I think that the other part of it is that the easiest, fastest, most accessible option to you doesn't mean it's the best one. So some of this work is going to take a long-term commitment to doing the right and most responsible thing over time. And that means foregoing some of our easiest options in the short run to achieve our long-term goals. I think when we do that, we will have better outcomes in the end, but we have to be willing to invest in that decision-making process for the long run so that my kids aren't sitting here when they are adults having the very same conversation, trying to undo the harms that have happened to various communities. And I really do believe in our ability to do this work thoughtfully and come to joint conclusions that are better for our city so we can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you to Priya and all of our other speakers as well. Really appreciate you taking the time to walk through these great points and have this discussion with us. We only have a couple minutes for questions, so we definitely won't get to them all, but thank you all for sharing your questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully follow up with some answers to some of these direct questions. But maybe in the last couple minutes, if the speakers could just quickly speak to this question, which I think is encompassing of a bunch of different concepts and themes that came up today. So it looks like changing street design is the key, but it takes time and is a very slow process because drivers often oppose better street design because they don't want to slow down and because they never see themselves as potential victims. How do we get past this impasse? And so that one was for Priya, but open to any of the panelists who'd like to share on that.
I mean, I think that part of it is it's not an educational component, but I think one thing I've learned from doing this work, because I'm not a street safety expert, I'm a criminal justice expert, is that when you set people up to fail is what they're going to do. So when I think about how some of our streets are designed in DC, you want people to slow down, but you have designed it for them not to, right? And then you're going to punish them. And so I actually do not know with infrastructure that sets its way how you do that. But I do know that there are places that even with existing big infrastructure needs and changes, they are making smaller, less expensive changes that are really, really meaningful. I've been super fascinated by the work in Hoboken and just watching it and seeing what they're doing in that city, because New Jersey is a state that outlaws automated traffic enforcement, but Hoboken is a city that has been able to achieve something that, as far as I know, no other city in this country has been able to achieve so far, which is 0 fatalities in 6 years, without a single camera in play, and with a lot of what I know Ryan Sharp calls fundamentals. And so not being an engineer, not being a design expert, I think there's so much to learn from that concept of what we can do that is not going to perpetuate harm, but is going to move us closer to our goal.
Any other panelists? Go ahead, Carlton.
What I was going to add to that, and thank you so much for that, Priya, is that the work I do with different communities around the country, I'm currently contracted with the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on developing a citywide safety plan to address both crime and police accountability. And reckless driving is something that comes up all the time during our community listening sessions. We're doing 15 of them, 1 per month. We're on number 8 right now to co-facilitate all those meetings. And something I could say is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to these issues. Every community in the US is its own community with its own unique history, its own unique demographics, its own unique culture. And any kind of solutions on these matters, which are public safety matters, need to align with all of that. So what that looks like when I'm saying this is essentially in Hoboken, that might work there, but that may not be the case in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That may not be the case in Chicago, Illinois. That may not be the case in New York City, because they each have their own unique demographics, history, and culture. So really making sure to empower, especially the people that live in those zip codes and those communities where there are both high levels of crime and high levels of negative police interactions, because those are the people who are going to be most impacted by any of these solutions because they live in those communities, right? So making sure that there's mechanisms and processes in place where they always have ongoing engagement, meaning they always have ongoing knowledge, involvement, substantive decision-making authority over what is going to happen in my community. That is going to be, in my opinion, the way that we find solutions for everybody through equity and inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlton. Gato or Ethan, any responses to that question or any sort of final closing remarks before we close and let people go?
Honestly, I really like what the 2 previous speakers
said already, which is there, there is no one size fits all. Every community is different. And yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thanks. Yeah, I also agree with what has been said. And I think I would just say to break that impasse that you spoke of, Axel, I think we need to not only organize on a grassroots basis like so many groups do across the country, but we really need political change. We need political leaders who are going to back those in planning agencies who will be making those hard decisions to change roadway design for safety. That's the only thing that's going to get through that impasse, making those smart decisions that are sometimes politically really challenging. Yeah, I think that's all.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you to all of our speakers and to our ASL interpreters as well. Really appreciate you all making the time today to have this discussion. And to our audience members, thank you for joining us and rejoining us and joining this conversation. I appreciate your perseverance. We'll be following up with the slides, the recordings, and make sure that folks have materials and resources to continue this dialogue. This is just the beginning of a conversation, so hope to continue sharing and discussing and dialoguing with you all out in the field. I shared a link in the chat as well if you're interested in joining the Transportation Equity Caucus. If you're not already, please either fill out that new member form or email me at asantana@policylink.org. Look forward to seeing you all again. Thanks, everybody.